Welcome to this program. I'm Ginny Stimson, and I welcome you on behalf of the Neighborhoods Committee. It's such a pleasure that Lorraine McConaghy lives here at Horizon House. I asked her, I said, Lorraine, how did you get so involved so quickly? And she said her friend Karen Lane, who lived here, said to her, part of living at Horizon House is to be part of committees and doing things. So we are blessed by that. I'm so glad that Karen had that conversation with you before she died. What a blessing. So tonight we have a program about the Seattle waterfront and all of Seattle during World War II. We're very pleased that Lorraine prepared this for a different audience. And she said, Ginny, it's pretty good. I think we'd like to do it at Horizon House. So what a joy that is. And I want to tell you, speaking of the waterfront, on April 14th, we're going to actually do a walking tour of the waterfront with a woman who led the tour for the UW Retirement Association, and it got good reviews. So April 14th, we're going to be continuing to think about the Seattle waterfront. So Lorraine, welcome and thank you for all you do for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Hello, welcome to this evening. I hope this isn't too loud. I'm sure we can adjust it if it is. So my name is Lorraine McConaghy. I do have the honor of living here at Horizon House. Karen Lane was a close friend, and she was the one who said to me that you have a responsibility as a resident here, and I've tried to take that responsibility seriously. So I did prepare this for Rhodes Scholar, but I've made a lot of changes. This is a sprawling topic, as I'm sure you realize. And I've been pruning, trimming, editing this all day. And this is not going to be 25 minutes. It's going to be long. So what is a Homefront Boomtown? What's all this about? World War II, we have a spectrum from the real front to the home front. And all along that spectrum, all along the course of the war, the federal government intervened with propaganda in the way that we would perceive our experience on the home front. Every wall of Seattle bloomed with propaganda posters. And I'd like to use those to mark chapters, essentially topical chapters, in what I'll be presenting to you, and also make the argument that World War II set home every nail that had been placed by the New Deal. We find the federalization of the Pacific Northwest proceeding apace on the World War II home front. And part of what I'll be showing these posters is to underline that. In my judgment, there are four major leaps forward in Seattle history. The first is Henry Esler's first steam-powered sawmill on Puget Sound in 1853. The second is the Klondike and Alaskan Gold Rush, starting in the 1890s, going all the way through the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition. The third is this home front. The fourth is the surge of technological innovation and venture capital in the 1980s into the 1990s. So that's how important I think this is. You think of a boomtown as a mushroom that will fade. This is a boomtown that had legs. Seattle never went back to the parochial provincial town it had been in the 30s. When we get into the Cold War period, which we'll do very, very briefly at the end, we will see Seattle mature as an industrial center, as a new political center, as a very new kind of culture, and it is part of what Horizon House is part of. This social, economic, cultural experiment of 1961 really owes much of its energy to the World War II home front and to the huge surge, not just of population, but of confidence that came at that time. So this is the first of the federal propaganda posters I'd like you to see, and it makes my point for me that a man with a rivet gun and a man with a gun, a rifle, these are two soldiers side by side on the same home front, the soldier of production and the soldier of combat. This is argued again and again and again. You'll get tired of seeing my posters about this issue, but this one is nice because it includes women on the home front in the argument equipment here. I'll carry mine too, she says. While the soldiers behind her are carrying their weapons, she's carrying her groceries. It's a very simple, beautifully designed, beautifully colored, grows right out of the New Deal Artist Project. I mean, you find many of the same designers working on these posters who were working for the federal government during the Great Depression. So we start with the Great Depression. Because World War II put a decisive end to the Great Depression, there is nothing that competes with what the mobilization of defense industries did to put people to work who had not been able to work. This, of course, is Seattle's Hooverville. We're familiar with it. We've seen the photograph many, many times. It is a representation of homeless people throughout the metropolitan area. When I think of Seattle, Metro Seattle, it's really Everett to Tacoma. It's the mountains to the Sound. And where I lived in Kirkland for so long, there were many small encampments of homeless people. So Hooverville isn't it. And if you read the PI and the Times online, you will see that as well. Oh, that's what's wrong. Whoops. Yeah, so this is what I have been talking about. You see Smith Tower there. You can orient yourself familiarly to this. Yeah, so everything I said, I ought to have been saying about this. But the burning out of Hooverville at the end of the Great Depression is one of the cruel segues to the mobilized home front of World War II. You got a job or you got out. And I think that that's a thing to remember. And now that I'm looking at this and getting my head back together, unemployment was 35% in Washington state at the high water mark of the Great Depression. It's almost impossible to get your head around that. And the statistic is not really accurate. No one was truly gathering that kind of information. There was no unemployment insurance to provide a metric for that. But 35% varied tremendously, whether you were talking about an urban industrial situation or whether you were talking about a rural agricultural situation. But the true pain and suffering of the Great Depression, we've almost forgotten. It's part of our parents' generation, I think. This is another federal poster, and it shows here the militarization of the New Deal. This is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it is a very militaristic image. These men are shown as not just brawny because they've been building trails, they're also marching and moving from the Great Depression to the World War II home front. We have that period of time when President Roosevelt is arming the Allies essentially under the table. And we're beginning to see Boeing ramp up production and the shipyards ramp up production long before Pearl Harbor. So the Depression comes to an end. It's a leading edge into World War II. And these men in the CCC and these men in the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, are being trained to do industrial work. They built the Grand Coulee Dam and a series of other dams on the Columbia River. And that's a monumental achievement, but it is also fundamental to the home front. You could not produce plutonium at Hanford without the electricity of this dam. You could not smelt aluminum in Washington state without the electricity from this dam. Ditto machine shops, ditto Boeing, ditto shipyards. So this New Deal creation was intentionally built in order to underpin the industrial growth of our state. And we are familiar with the I-90 bridge across Lake Washington. It opened in 1940. It opened up the east side to the home front. It opened up the east side to post-war GI Bill residential subdivision constructions. It was the bridge to the future, and it also grew out of New Deal policies and projects. When the United States entered World War II, it was because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which we see here in this headline, the data that's reported here is incorrect, but I just wanted you to see the size of this war news. Many people, perhaps some of you in this room, know where you were when you heard the news about Pearl Harbor. It changed everything. It changed people's minds. And a graphic like this, which, oops. I can make it a little bit bigger there. What's being argued here is that, do you remember when Cuba was only 90 miles off our coast, right? This is the same argument. It's very easy for Japan to attack the Pacific Northwest, and we're looking here from Alaska down through Sitka, down through down into Seattle area, into Portland and Northern California. It's meant to alarm and inform that Japan was much closer than it had been thought to be. And along with that came the demonization of Japanese people as the enemy. And that included people among whom our parents lived, among whom some of you lived, where because of the ethnic identity of a person of Japanese descent in King County and the ethnic identity of bomber pilots at Pearl Harbor, they became the same enemy. And you see here there's dozens of posters like this that use the metaphor of rape, of violence, of brutality to characterize the enemy. And that is applied by racists in this community to the Japanese and Japanese Americans among whom we lived in Metro Seattle. The first step against people of Japanese descent here was to require that they deposit all of their cameras and all of their radios at local police stations. So that is what you're seeing here, is people lined up out the door to comply. Reading the Post-Intelligence or in the Times online at the Seattle Public Library day by day in December of 41 into January and February of 42, you see the increasing repression and anger against people who looked like the enemy and so were able to be treated as though they were. This is December 29th, 1941. So this is before even the turn of the year. You've probably seen this poster before. It bloomed on walls all over metropolitan Seattle. This one was in Kirkland. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. And those very brave Japanese Americans, by and large Nisei, citizens born in the United States who ought to have had all the rights that any American-born citizen would have, rebelled in acts of civil disobedience against not just turning in their radios and cameras, but in ignoring the curfew that meant that students at the University of Washington who were taking law classes at night or engineering classes in the late afternoon could not get back at this time of the year before dusk fell, before dark fell, and were therefore liable to arrest. Gordon Hirabayashi is a name that most of us probably know as one of the preeminent civil disobedient resistors at this time. But what this poster says is that can you hear okay? Yeah. What this poster says is that you must gather at a particular spot. You could carry what you could carry, and that was all you could take. Think what that meant. When you downsized to come here, you went through a tiny bit of what these people went through with their whole lives. First generation people of Japanese ancestry, Issei, were forbidden to become naturalized citizens. They were forbidden to own property. So the only property owned by Japanese people in Metro Seattle was owned by the Issei, the second generation, who, as I said, were born in the United States. In many oral histories, Issei make it clear that they feared that their parents might be interned, but they doubted very much that they themselves would be. That would turn out to be incorrect. This is a strawberry farmer in Bellevue. I did a fair amount of work on Bellevue. There were 55 farming families of Japanese descent prior to the war. Only 3 returned at the end of the war, and all of them owned their land in the names of their children, ise, who were permitted to own the land. The others went east or went elsewhere. They were no longer welcome at home. Look at photos of the Pike Place Market. I took them all out of here. But before the war, agriculture in King County was a Japanese-American occupation, and that was no longer the case after internment. So Bainbridge Island, this is another famous photo of people of Japanese descent filing onto the ferry from Bainbridge Island. That was the first internment on the West Coast. These 300 people who were brought from the island. In all of Metro Seattle, 7,000 Issei, Nisei, and Sansei, third generation people of Japanese descent, were interned. This is Fumika Hayashida. She is, again, with her baby with a tag and a number. She is one of the faces of internment. She is one of the people that we remember when we think about how unjust this was. No charges, no evidence, no trial, just internment. So either you got on the train in Kirkland or you got on the bus in Kent and you went down to Camp Harmony, which you may recognize as the home of the Washington State Fair in Puyallup. This is how people were treated there. We are fortunate to have a great deal of first-person oral history interviews to tell us what it felt like to be herded like cattle. And that is a phrase one hears again and again and again, that one's humanness, one's dignity was deliberately stripped away by this process. At Camp Harmony, the gathering and then the sorting of internees was done. Minidoka, Camp Minidoka in western Idaho, was the destination for most of the interned people of Japanese descent from our area. This is a tragedy. But this is another federal poster underlining the consequences of this. One of the rumors that had spun around, and the rumors were repeated in the PI and the Times on the front page, it would say, this rumor is erroneous, and then it would reprint the rumor. But one of the rumors was that Japanese farmers had planted their crops so that they made arrows when they grew up at the Boeing plant, or at the Lake Washington Shipyard, or at Todd's, or whatever. And so this was very much focused on agriculture, and there was an effort to publicly own their farms and to bring on crews like this, the Women's Land Army, to harvest the fruit and vegetables that there was no one left to harvest. The braceros are, I think, particularly interesting phenomenon right now. So the braceros we see here in Spanish, the recruitment poster for braceros, people who work with their arms, work with their hands, to come to farms in the United States and replace the people of Japanese descent who had been interned, or the men who enlisted or were recruited as soldiers. So this is not just like 500 people in Ellensburg. This is tens of thousands of Mexican field workers who were brought to Washington State and to California and Oregon and elsewhere to harvest crops. So recruitment to the real front and the home front. I've made the argument that these are places on a spectrum, and they're not entirely separate. This is an adaptation of a very famous poster from World War I, which has here been updated in order to tap into the vein of patriotism. I am, I think, a very cynical person by nature, but there is a very real sense of patriotism after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the deaths as they were told in the newspaper, the threat to the Western United States that we have seen in the newspaper. I want you come to the nearest recruiting station, and women are being recruited as well. Women who had been bullied and begged to stay in their kitchens during the Great Depression so that they wouldn't take a job from a man who had the sexual prerogative to that kind of pride in a job. Women who had been told to stay home and make babies and cakes were now encouraged to learn a skill and go into factories, or to be a Marine and free a Marine to fight. So we're talking here about clerical jobs, really, rather than any kind of actual combat position. Nevertheless, some of you are very artistically inclined. I think some of these posters are extraordinary in the way they communicate to the viewer. So this is an enlistment celebration in downtown Seattle. There's one almost every day, month after month after month after month, as men responded to the opportunity, to the call to defend their families, to defend their mothers, to defend their fathers, to defend their land. This is just a sample of what could be many, many slides of recruiting to the home front. Because as 16 million men and women went into uniform in World War II, 9 million men and women went to the home front in World War II. 16 million into uniform, 9 million into defense industries. It's a huge, when you take a tablecloth and go like that, it's just like that. The United States was never the same again after that dramatic resortment of people. These are just jobs that were available locally. I mentioned the New Deal training programs. They were extended into the wartime period. You would get paid as soon as you came on the job, and you would get paid to learn a trade. Where there had been people sitting in hovels in Hooverville with nothing to do, now there were jobs for everyone. And every week, the federal orders grew and grew and grew at Boeing, at the shipyards, in the machine shops, in the paint shops. It was a phenomenal time here in Seattle. The soldiers of production. One does not often see this phrase, so it's nice to see it right here, because we're going to be talking about the barracks for the soldiers of production, which were the public housing projects that sprang up all over Western Washington, but throughout metropolitan King County. So here we have the soldiers of production, and we have a wounded combat soldier close to us, and behind him, an attack on a ship. A good soldier sticks to his post, and that includes soldiers of production. This is a poster against absenteeism, which was a problem always, and was a problem during World War II as well. Race. So we've talked about women being invited, bullied really, to come into the workforce in World War II, but so also were men and women of color. And men and women of color were recruited specifically. There were trains that went through the agricultural Southeast, and they would stop in a given tiny town, and a Boeing representative would stand up on his hind legs at the back and say to his audience of black sharecroppers, "There is no racial prejudice in Seattle. When you get to Seattle, you will be astounded at how you will be treated and how you will be welcomed." And oral history again tells us again and again of how surprised many newcomers were at the experience at the welcome that they received. But here we see a poster, a federal poster, that is propagandizing that the soldiers of production can work side by side and be of different races. It's an argument that you would need to make on the wartime home front. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt styled himself as Dr. New Deal, and then he became Dr. Win the War. And I've mentioned twice that I've cut this presentation down quite a lot. This stands for a lot. This is snow training, Arctic training for United States Army paratroopers on Mount Rainier. But it could be the Bremerton Naval Shipyard. It could be Fort Lewis. It could be Fort Lawton. It could be Todd Shipyard. It could be any place that was a military installation on the home front. This stands for so much, and that is part of the federalization of this place, the part of the growth of the military here that we really take for granted in many ways. That Joint Base Lewis McChord is absolutely enormous. That grows out of this period of time into the Cold War. But probably what we're most accustomed to thinking about are B-17s and B-29s. And the Boeing company, not only here, but also in other factories, assembled thousands of B-17s and B-29, which are the long-range bombers that won the war. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We'll see in a few minutes, well, we'll see very soon, the switchover at the Boeing Plant 2 from manufacturing B-17s full tilt boogie to manufacturing B-29s full tilt boogie. It's April of 1945. This is very late in the war that these kind of massive bombers were being built that would eventually drop the atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is the reality of this bomber. But this photograph is just full of wonderful information. No matter how wide our camera lens might be, we would see more people. The employment numbers at Boeing just simply go through the roof. Hundreds of thousands in installations all across the United States. Here, you can not only see Plant 2, and you see the B-29 and the B-17, but you also see the camouflage that has been painted on the side of the building. And if you look at the tippy top of the building, you can see the little trees and houses that are up there. If we look down from above, you'll see an entire fake town has been created on the top of Boeing Plant 2 and its parking lot. And I don't think anything brings home more clearly the fear of aerial invasion. It was very, very real. That, how far away is Hawaii? How far away is Sitka? How far away is Alaska? How far away is Russia? They were close to the United States, and the thought was that the Japanese would be able to use them as bases. So this camouflage is not only interesting as a kind of, it would alarm me every day if I went to work and thought about what the camouflage meant, but it also reflected the reality of the fear of attack. Talk about a design. I mean, this is a phenomenal design. And the notion is that you know things working at Boeing or working in a shipyard or working as a clerk. You know things that you should never say aloud, because someone is watching you and listening to you. And you may be the one responsible for deaths of our men and women at sea, in the air, on the ground, because of your loose lips that sank their ships. But it's a very powerful image. And again, I would just ask you in your imagination to imagine the walls of Seattle, not covered with graffiti, but covered with posters like these. So this is a production line at the Boeing company. And this is what Boeing will take into the Cold War. Boeing will never look back to the days of making one plane at a time, where you start at the bottom and you go to the top and you go from one wing to the end of the other wing. This is about mass production, multiple production. And this is what will underpin Boeing's success in the Cold War, and after that, in the multiple production of commercial jetliners, of aerospace. This is where they learned it. And they learned it on the cost plus contract, kind of a marvelous federal contract where whatever it cost Boeing to build one of those fuselages and to outfit it and to paint it and to do everything that needed to be done to it to put it in the air, whatever that cost would be reimbursed, and the profit would be a fixed percentage of that cost. So you accountant people, think about that. There's absolutely no reason to economize. The more you spend, the more you make. The more you spend, the more you make. So there's extravagant cost overruns. They are continual headlines in the PI and the Times about this investigation or that investigation, overmanning, where people would be found sleeping in the double hull, or just all kinds of ways of adding cost in order to make more money in the end. Soldiers without guns, you see here a woman with a welding cap, a woman at a typewriter, a Rosie the Riveter. Soldiers without guns. Again, the argument here that the real front and the home front have quite a lot to do with each other. Requirements of the cost-plus contract were that all your employees, except for engineers and managers, had to belong to a labor union. It was an absolute triumph for union interests that if you had a federal contract during World War II, every welder, every machinist, every riveter that you employed had to belong to the union. So that was a wonderful thing for the unions. But the federal government also said the unions must open their ranks to women and men and women of color. That was not so easy for the labor unions. And here in Seattle, we find in particular the Boilermakers 104 union, local, which was really the biggest labor union in the shipyards, resisting that mightily and giving cards that were stamped for the duration. For the duration. You were a member of the union only for the duration. So you got union wages, but when the war was over, you were no longer a member of the union. So if you painted camouflage on the side of seaplane tenders, you might be a member of the painters union, but you weren't going to be, after the war was over, you weren't going to be painting houses in Lake Hills or in some other GI residential subdivision. So these women are looking mystified at this engine. This is at PACCAR. This kind of training I have mentioned, people were trained from the moment they walked on the job, they were paid. Popular culture, we have very, very little time to talk about it, but this is a movie you've probably never seen. I've never seen it, but it has just wonderful imagery for what we're talking about. She's got great legs. He seems to be saluting her legs, and behind her are dancing these women with welding gloves, right? And a rivet gun. I mean, could it be any better? It's just sensational. And you know, you've got the home front. People work hard, they play hard. Seattle becomes a 24-hour-a-day city. It was a very wild city. It was in some cases a dangerous and lawless city, but it was a city that played hard. A lot of good music, a lot of dancing, a lot of drinking, and a lot of sex. In downtown Seattle, I had the chance to do an oral history interview with a woman who called herself a patriotute. A patriotute was a high school student at Roosevelt High School who went downtown and found servicemen and asked them if they wanted to go to bed with her. It was a patriotic act. And the prostitutes who were, you know, working for a living would slap her and beat her up. And I mean, this is a side of Seattle I think is absolutely extraordinary. So this is Frederick and Nelson's. I'm sure many of you remember that department store. This was one of its display windows. And you could go in there and buy those one-piece gabardine zip-up suits that the mannequins are wearing there, standing next to their machine tools. And you can see the posters I've been talking about plastering the walls back there. It's just it's an information-rich image, and to think of it in a department store display window is quite lovely. This is inside Frederick and Nelson's. This is a display of weapons on top of a hosiery display. Now, you could not get silk stockings unless you got them on the black market, but you could buy cotton hose, which everyone remembers, bagged at the knees and sagged at the ankles. It made everyone look like it had really bad legs. That's what's for sale under these crossed weapons. But this is inside a department store on the World War II home front. Lovely photograph. This is from PACCAR. These women work together, and we see them holding rivet guns. I may be giving an incorrect impression that this is all sort of fake and funny. It's not. I mean, this was very, very real. These women helped to win the war. They learned how to do their jobs well. They earned the money that they got. They were perhaps independent for the first time in their lives. They may have had pink-collar jobs as waitresses or hairstylists. Here, in a blue-collar industry, they made big dough, reliably. You were paid double time for overtime. I mean, it was the kind of work that women had never had, that men and women of color had never had. This photograph is remarkable. It was revealed in the wall of a place that had been a boarding house during World War II in downtown Seattle. It was just stuck in the wall. And we see here these women in front of a B-29, and they're all named. And when I worked at the museum, we did biographical genealogical research on all of them in order to beef up their biographies. Isn't it a fabulous photograph? And I suppose there are hundreds of these, but I have only seen this one of these 8 named Black women here in Seattle who had been brought from Chicago, from tiny town Alabama, to the wonders of this place. So I mentioned the Boilermakers 104. This was a very tough local. When I went there to do oral history interviews, they made me drink a Boilermaker before they would allow me to record them. It's beer and some liquor. Do you know? Scotch? I was not accustomed to it. But the 104 Reporter was their periodical. And this cartoon in the thought of the time is a tremendous insult to the woman. She's so good at her job in the shipyard, you can't tell her from a man. She's beefy, she's brawny, she's overweight. The guy looking at the man going into the men's room and the woman going into the woman's room can't tell them apart. And this is one of dozens of such cartoons that are meant to say, if you are doing well in an industrial job, you are not a real woman. You are not a feminine woman. And no man will want you as a feminine woman because one interview I did, the guy said, let me tell you what she was like. She wore her wallet in her back pocket just like a man. That's what she was like. And it's just great that we can learn these things. So everyday life on the Seattle home front. Where are all these people gonna live? Where are they all gonna sleep? The housing shortage was incredibly acute. And the place where we found that photograph of the 8 Black women, it had been a hotbed rooming house during the war. A hotbed rooming house is where you sleep for 8 hours, then the next person sleeps for 8 hours, then the next person sleeps for 8 hours, so the bed never cools off. There was nothing else to do. In Kirkland, where I lived, people lived in chicken houses. They went out into abandoned farmhouses in the country and took them over. Okies, Arkies, that's how they were made fun of. But these poor people who have probably just got off the bus and have been recruited by promises of a big dough in Seattle are going into what is probably a hotbed rooming house. This, however, is Yesler Terrace. And one of our stories that's extraordinary is that of Jesse Epstein, who was one of the first advocates for public housing to insist that they be racially integrated. We'll be talking a bit about the King County Housing Authority, whose public housing was racially segregated. But my first visit here to Horizon House was to interview a woman named Doris Eason, who worked for Jesse Epstein on this project and was very proud of it. So this was a racially integrated public housing project for war workers, for the soldiers of production. This was a barracks for the soldiers of production in Kirkland, Washington. It's where the college is now, the Northwest College. And they ran the water lines on top of the ground. So whenever the temperature fell below 32 degrees, the water froze. they reopened the coal mines in southwest King County because the only way you could cook or heat in these places was with coal. This is very soft coal. It was smoky. People didn't like to put their laundry out because it would get all gray with the smoke. Many of the oral history stories about Okies and Arkies come from this place, Stewart Heights in Kirkland. Stories about people who didn't understand what a toilet was, so they tried to wash their feet in it. That was all they could think of doing with it. People who urinated in coffee cans and tossed that out the back door. What else? Oh, people who built fires with coal in their ranges that were from time to time powered with gas. It kind of went on and on. There were lots of jokes about Okies and Arkies, that they were not city people, that they didn't talk right, that they didn't know nothing about nothing, and that they were dangerous to work by. Rationing. So probably a few of you have a ration book in your collection. This is a ration book that was ubiquitous at the time. What was rationed? I asked somebody that once, and he said, everything I wanted was rationed. So sugar, meat, butter, cheese, coffee, most canned goods. And then non-food items like tires, gasoline, oil, and fabric. Just about everything you could want was not available. You couldn't buy a car because all of the production of the automobile industry was going into making jeeps or military vehicles. People joke in oral histories a lot about the crummy furniture you could buy that was just slung together, anything, because everything important was set aside for war production. And there were endless drives. Right, so the South Pacific is in the hands of the Japanese. So there's no rubber. Think about what that means. So little kids like this went from door to door to get your girdles and the elastic out of the back of your bras in order to use it in war production. Everywhere you could find rubber, it was essential. These Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts are gathering newspapers for a paper drive. Here, the Teamsters local are celebrating by throwing pots up in the air, the metal drive that they have been on. To have extra cooking equipment in your kitchen when it could be made into munitions, it was the wrong thing to do. It was an unpatriotic thing to do, to not support the war effort. Another amazingly designed poster. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car-sharing club today. You couldn't get tires. Gasoline was rationed. You couldn't buy a new car. Don't waste your car. Somebody I interviewed, he and his friends used to throw rocks at cars that only had one person in them. And when they siphoned gas out of cars to go up skiing, they would always siphon it from a doctor or a minister's car because they got extra gasoline. But when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Again, there isn't any ordinary everyday activity that you can do that doesn't come freighted with the war effort. There's a lot of wonderful this was a lot easier when I was doing it another time. Anyway, I won't do that. This is a map of Seattle. And this is a car-sharing map of Seattle. So if you could actually see it, you'd see that there were places you were supposed to gather to get organized so you could all go to Boeing in a car. Or you could all go to Todd Shipyard in a car. That driving alone was a bad idea. The buses exploded. It was standing room only in public transportation here. But this reminds me also of an interview, and I don't think it was here. It was Dr. Errol Rawson, R-A-W-S-O-N, who was in charge of the medical response in Seattle if there should be an aerial attack with gas and incendiaries. Gas and incendiaries. And the assumption was that the city would have been softened up ahead of that by bombardment of all the bridges across the Lake Washington cut. So his job was to figure out where badly burned, gassed people could be taken in Seattle for triage. And he had a map just like this, only it was different because it was about medical emergencies. So this is very real. It isn't just entertainment. This really is local. William Devon. I don't think Bobby Spaeth is here, but she would know all about William Devon, one of the mayors of Seattle who belonged to the moral rearmament movement that I bored some of you with. If you can read this while I'm talking, you'll see that morale is the secret weapon that can win the war. And your morale was so important because it what would keep you going to work. It would keep you buying bonds. It would keep you from using from buying steaks on the black market when you weren't allowed to. It would keep you from doing anything that was unpatriotic or unproductive on the home front. But William Devon was a remarkable mayor. It is he who really created the Civic Unity Committee, of which I think some of you have heard. The Civic Unity Committee tried to find a solution to what was emerging as a serious racial problem in Seattle. These African Americans who had been recruited here for high pay and respect did not always find that that was the case, and that they were barred from, actually I forgot to say that, darn it. The King County Housing Authority was racially segregated housing. So this is in Kirkland. There was a shipyard in Kirkland called the Lake Washington Shipyard, and the 7% of the workforce who were black had to commute by ferry across Lake Washington every day in order to get to their jobs in Kirkland. They were not allowed to live here. There was racial segregation in the King County Housing Authority. Sorry, I spaced that. So the Civic Unity Committee, I think it's important to realize that even though there was a huge effort for morale and to speak with one voice, there were dissidents. Floyd Schmo may be a name known to some of you Quakers in the audience or people interested in Quakerism. He was one of the foremost defenders of people of Japanese descent, and it is he who smoothed the way back for them into the city. Devon's Civic Unity Committee, you can see some of the members of the committee are significant names to us, but out of this grew the Christian Friends for Racial Equality, that I think there's a couple people who were members of that here. It was an effort to bring African American people into the society of the city, and Devon, I think, deserves credit for that. This is Victory Square. This is University Street between 4th and 5th Avenue. This was the center of morale in the city. There was some kind of a rally here or entertainment nearly every day. And you can see how enormous this crowd is. In that sort of little cupola thing, they kept track of the deaths of men and women. 7,000 who died from King County were listed in that place. War bonds, that's really what Victory Square was about, was buying war bonds. And you see here by Norman Rockwell the adoption of one of FDR's 4 freedoms. Here, the freedom of speech. That this untutored man at a Vermont town hall can speak freely and receive the admiration of his better dressed peers. That was freedom of speech. It's used here to sell war bonds. It's interesting to see the sort of marketing, really, of these ideas. And here is Bob Hope at Victory Square, entertaining an enormous crowd of Homefront people. And he'll sing and he'll tell jokes, but eventually he'll say, buy war bonds. And this is Lana Turner doing the same thing here in Seattle. So these stars, comedians, movie stars, vocalists, we were on a circuit in the United States of selling war bonds. Jackson Street, wonderful book, Jackson Street After Hours. This photo is from there. The Black and Tan Club and all of the jazz clubs up Jackson Street out of Chinatown, really out of Japantown. This is just a wonderful example of what are dozens of such photographs, and this kind of music drew GIs. It drew GIs who were in town on liberty to kick off and have some fun for a while. And it's just as joyous as it looks. These two women, and I'm sorry for the quality of the image, these are the Polk sisters, and they were the directors of entertainment at Camp George Jordan. We're talking about a time, World War II, when the military was segregated racially. It won't be integrated until 1948. So men are dying and fighting side by side in foxholes or in tanks. But once they come back to the port of embarkation here in Seattle, they're separated by race. So they are working at a black encampment in South Seattle. White soldiers went to Fort Lewis, to Camp Lewis, or to Fort Lawton. So these are the Polk sisters, and they made it their mission to create integrated entertainment. And this is a photograph of one of their victory canteens. So you know there's the USO, there's all kinds of ways to entertain soldiers on liberty. This is one where Marjorie Polk Sotero, again, recorded an oral history interview saying, there were blacks dancing with whites and nothing terrible happened. And I just knew it was always going to be that way. And I was right. And we did it throughout the entire war. It was a time for that kind of experimentation and confidence. This is at the Naval Reserve Armory, at where Mohi is now at South Lake Union. And this is innocent fun. This is a USO dance. This is not so innocent. Or we don't really know the narrative here. You know, what is the relationship between these people? Have they known each other 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 years, 10 days? But I think this pent-up energy of fear and anger and wanting to let go, it's just palpable. And that's a wonderful photo. At least they're drinking coffee. But this is another poster. Here we find, this is a VD poster, right? She may be a bag of trouble, syphilis and gonorrhea. So they're seeing these film strips at all of the military facilities about how dangerous women are, and that you really shouldn't touch them, let alone really touch them. And look at this siren that we see here. Very effective poster, I guess. We've talked a fair amount about B-17s and B-29s. Let's talk a little bit about shipbuilding. This is the Lake Washington Shipyard in Kirkland. And right across the lake, west across the lake here, Boeing was demonstrating, was piloting, was trying out its seaplanes. So the seaplane tenders were intended to accompany the seaplanes. Seaplane tenders are like floating machine shops in order to maintain those seaplanes. But look at the headline of this. This is early 1942. Japanese become Japs right away in the newspapers, in the magazines. It's just that crude and insulting contraction that it's just ubiquitous. You just see it everywhere. The federal government invested huge sums of money in this shipyard that had been building ships since the 1890s and built most of the ferries that plied Lake Washington. So everything you see here, you see the 5 building ways going into Lake Washington. You see this huge crane, the assembly crane. All of this was paid for by the United States Navy. So the investment in infrastructure, in industrial capability during the war was huge. This was paid for by the U.S. Navy as well. This was the periodical of the Lake Washington Shipyard during the war. And you see Santa Claus disguised as a Lake Washington Shipyard worker with his little hat and his badge, holding a seaplane tender to put in Uncle Sam's stocking. It makes us smile, but it didn't make them smile. For them, it was encouraging. It was real. This is the launch of the Chincoteague seaplane tender from that site. And all of these ships were built at that shipyard during the war. What happened afterwards? It became Carillon Point, for those of you who know the east side at all. And the shipyard is just a memory. Civilian defense. every one of you, every one of us would have had a role to play on the home front in keeping us safe. We would be the neighborhood commandos of civilian defense to make sure that the blackout was met. Okay, we have this fear of aerial attack. So the last thing you want to do is illuminate the target. So you cover up your windows, as this smiling lady is agreeing to do with the smiling civil defense warden. This kind of practice was ubiquitous. Every neighborhood had a civil defense unit, and here they're triaging some kind of imaginary attack that has come to them. Here in Seattle, the Red Cross grew hugely during the war. They were identified by the federal government as the only repository for blood and blood products, so for blood and plasma. So giving blood was an act of patriotism, and it was encouraged by posters like this. There isn't an act on the home front, no matter how humdrum or ordinary, that doesn't have extra meaning. So we come to the end of the war. First VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and then VJ Day, and that's what we see here. Accepting the terms, and then the reality of what had been happening at Hanford. That the people who were working there, who thought they were making linoleum or lipstick, were actually making plutonium. And that was the plutonium that was used in the Nagasaki bomb. So this is the Richland Villager. President Truman releases the secret of the Hanford Project, interviewing editors and editorialists, writers, reporters from the newspapers during the war. Hanford was an open secret, but there was such self-censorship that was encouraged by the patriotism of the war that it was not reported in the newspapers, even though it was widely known what was happening there. This is our Homefront celebration poster. This is our Homefront celebration end of the war symbol, equivalent to the Times Square photo of the sailor bending the nurse over his arm. This guy is no longer living, but he used to write to me every year and say, "Is my photo on display at MOHI?" Because he was extremely proud and happy to remember this day. These guys weren't so happy because their jobs were being terminated overnight. All of the federal contracts that I've talked about, all the cost-plus contracts for B-17s and seaplane tenders and everything that Todd was building, the destroyers, just canceled overnight. So people were laid off in waves at the end of the war in the fall of 1945. By Christmas, nearly everyone had been laid off who was going to be laid off. And there was suffering. There simply were not the jobs to be found that had been found. And that made this question more probing, I suppose. Should I use the GI Bill to go back to school? And this guy is probably thinking about, well, engineering college or law school. But the GI Bill of Rights also provided for learning how to wire a house, or to repair a a diesel engine, any kind of vocational skill that you might need. You could also get small business loans to start a place like Chubby and Tubby's. Any of you remember Chubby and Tubby's? And then what probably made the most importance to us is the GI Bill for housing, where you could, as a veteran, you could buy a house, no money down, with your rate of mortgage guaranteed by the government, usually 3%, 2.5%, but it had to be new construction. I don't think we think often enough about what that meant to America. It meant that places like Lake Hills, which were built on strawberry fields and all kinds of farmland, they were valueless compared to the new houses that could be built there, and you couldn't use your GI Bill opportunity for a used house. It had to be brand new. So we have these residential subdivisions, the Levittowns of America, springing up all over. Here we see Eleanor Roosevelt here in Seattle decorating Sam Morris, who had been a hero during the Fry packing plant fire. When Boeing was working on the B-29, there was a terrible accident where the flight failed and crashed into the Fry meatpacking plant, and the incendiary fats and other materials that were in the meatpacking plant made it just an inferno. He went in and saved 5 people. She's giving him an award here. But I'd like to remind us again what it was like to be Black in the Army. This is Fort Lewis. The man on the left here is named Letcher Yarborough. He's standing next to Thurgood Marshall, who was the first Black justice on the Supreme Court. Letcher Yarborough recorded an interview where he told a story about coming off one of those troop ships with injured buddies coming back from the front, and that they came out in baskets. I mean, you were that injured that you left the ships in a basket, and they went to the military hospital. But when they were well enough, the Blacks went to their place and the whites went to theirs, unless you were an officer. So he had a stripe. He was a sergeant. So he ended up at Fort Lewis. And when he was there, he wanted to see a movie. And he went to the movie theater, which was on the base, and he sat himself down. And an MP came down the aisle and he said, "I'm sorry, you can't sit here." And he said, "What do you mean I can't sit here? This is where I want to be." And he said, "You're Black. You can't sit here. You need to go back there." And Yarborough said, "I'm not moving. I've just come home from combat in the war. I've been wounded. I'm a sergeant. This is where I want to sit and watch this movie." So the MP arrested him and took him to the stockade. And the next day, his chaplain came to see him and said, "You really must alter your position or you're going to lose your stripe." And he said, "If I'm going to lose my stripe, I'm going to lose it for something like this. So you can have my stripe." And he put it more bluntly than that to the chaplain, who really, poor guy. So Yarborough lost his stripe. He wasn't a sergeant anymore. And the way his oral history ended is maybe the saddest thing. He said, "We never went back to the theater again." So they had been suppressed. That's a reality. And so is this. No Japs wanted. This is in Seattle. I almost feel I know where this is. It's on the 44 bus route. No Japs wanted. No Japs wanted here. So there's a surge of anti-Japanese resentment at the end of the war that these may return. This meeting in the Bellevue High School made the national news. I ran across it in Time magazine. Time magazine was astounded that in April of 1946, there would be such a gathering as this. Do you want Japs for your neighbors again? The problem of Japanese resettlement vitally concerns you and every other resident of Washington. We must keep the Jap off the Pacific coast, and so on and so on. I said 46, I should have said 45, pardon me. So this mass meeting drew hundreds of people to the Bellevue High School, and they gave away door prizes. And it was so shocking to the national press that it was published in Time magazine as an extraordinary example of how racist Washington people were. And there were other organizations than this. There was the Remember Pearl Harbor League. There was the White River Associates of Farmers. There were others who wanted to keep the Japanese from returning to their farms. And now we move into the Cold War. And the Soviet Union, which had been an ally during World War II, very rapidly became an enemy when the war was over. The United States lost its atomic primacy. It lost its atomic monopoly to the Soviet Union, and there was much fear of secrets being passed, of the Red Menace in universities, in labor unions, in the State Department, in any place that you would care to name. And again, here in our state, we had the Canwell hearings. In 1947, this photograph is taken in what is now, well, the food circus is what I would call it, but whatever you call that building at the heart of Seattle Center, you can recognize the paneling. This was the joint House-Senate Subcommittee for the Investigation of Un-American Activities in the State of Washington. It preceded McCarthy by years, and it really kind of rolled out a lot of the techniques he would use. You can read the entire transcript of these hearings, and it's very clear that simply the way you lived was a way to associate you with communist ideas. So white women who dated black men, couples who went to hootenannies and heard folk music or danced folk dances. If there was one right way to live, and that was white collar, white, upright, middle class way of life. At the University of Washington, the hearings took down a number of professors and graduate students who were not backed by the Board of Regents or by the president of the university. So this is where I'm going to end. Thank you for your patience. I mentioned early on that this place, Horizon House, has a lot of its basis in the confidence and the experimentation of the World War II home front. And you've heard a lot of things about that home front that are perhaps less than appealing. But in the long run, over the long haul, what really came out of that is this. Century 21, a belief in 1962 that the 21st century would be better, that we would make it better, that where we're living today in 2025, this would be a good place to live. It would be a secure place. It would be a place not of wealth necessarily, but of security. And it would be a place where we respected one another. Century 21, you see here the iconography of it, the Space Needle, the monorail curling onto the land, and the little icon of the 21st century, the place we are now. This is an inspiration to us, I think, to do better, to take the best of what the home front gave us and leave the rest behind. Thank you very much.
Comments or questions?
This was fabulous. I worked at Boeing in the 60s, and I was almost forced to buy war bonds. They tracked it, how many do you buy? You had to buy one every quarter, and so I'm stuck with these bonds.
Well, I think it's important. I know I didn't say this, I'm sorry, but the war bonds were almost kind of an enforced savings plan because you couldn't buy anything. I mean, people went to the movies again and again and again to see the same show because you couldn't spend your money on anything worthwhile. So you bought bonds, and it was like putting money in the bank. Joan.
I was a super duper newspaper bundler and carrying along with scrap metals, and bought saving stamps that I put in a book, and if you got enough, you could get a savings bond. But I wanted to just do a follow-up on Letcher Yarborough and Doris Eason, who got their revenge by becoming part of Seattle's civil rights movement and boycotting and picketing and sitting in on places that had discriminated against them.
Absolutely.
On Bainbridge Island is where the first Japanese were interred and forced to leave.
Oh.
And there's a lovely and very reverential museum just on the water there, which commemorates the women, particularly, getting onto the ferry
Thank you.
with their little children and so forth, forced to leave their homes and so forth.
Yeah.
It's also true that some people the newspaper editor was the only person on the West Coast to defend
Well-
Japanese and speak out against that that terrible internment.
Walt and Millie Woodward were the publishers of that newspaper, and you're absolutely right. They were the only newspaper people on the whole West Coast to speak out against internment. And again, doing interviews with people who were publishers and editors here during the war, they knew it was wrong, but they censored themselves because they thought it was the patriotic thing to do. It's really something
In
to
the
think
spring, we have a field trip planned to Bainbridge Island to visit the site where that we saw where they went on the dock there, and there's some really inspirational messages and things there. So that's planned for the spring.
I grew up in Chicago, but I remember vividly. I was 5 years old when the war started, and we had victory gardens. I'm sure they had them here. You grew vegetables because yourself. And the other thing was, every day of the week, you took something. There was newspaper days. There was any kind of metal you could find. You put it in the metal pile. And every day you took something and dumped it in a pile at the school, and it was trucked off. So, you had really sense that you portrayed beautifully that everybody got involved in supporting the war. And every Friday, my folks gave me 10 cents for a stamp. And when you had $17.50 worth of stamps, you got a bond. And in 25 years, $17.50 got you $25. Wow.
I had several faculty friends that I knew that were convicted and beaten up by the Canwell Committee. And I remember many, many, many years later when Canwell was a very old man, he was being interviewed by what was preceded NPR, and he had no regrets whatsoever about he thought he had done a very good thing that had helped the country.
Canwell is really quite unique in not donating his papers to any archive. So we have no idea of what motivated him or what he really thought. But you're absolutely right. He never reneged, never apologized. Susan?
I was thinking about James Washington's trajectory while you were talking. We have a piece of his work in the hall, and he came up from the South during the beginning of World War II, and he worked in the shipyards as an electrical person, and he said it was so high stress because he didn't know very much about how to do it. So he managed to get himself transferred to be a shoemaker, which was his profession in the South, and he was a shoemaker at more than a shoemaker. He did all sorts of orthotics and things in Fort Lewis. Fort Lewis was the white place, right, you said? Yeah. And then he went on from there after the war to be a huge activist for civil rights, like Joan was talking about. He went to Safeway and all these places.
Right.
So it's an interesting trajectory that he sort of scooted. Oh, and also he had his work shown at Frederick and Nelson, which had an art gallery, and it was part of an integrated show. So it's interesting to think about that one trajectory in terms of the racism that you talked about and how he kind of was able to avoid the oppressions by taking certain moves. It's very interesting.
There's a fellow named Tim Martin who was the first black man to buy a house in Lake Hills. And Lake Hills was all white. And he bought, it was a second house. It was a resale. And when the owner sold to him, the owner received death threats from his neighbors for breaking the neighborhood, an expression we may have all heard. Breaking the neighborhood by selling to a black man and his white wife. Martin, like others we've mentioned here, became very active in CORE, active in NAACP. But the boldness required to do what Washington did, what the guy I'm talking about, Martin, these are exceptional people, right? So asking people of color to be exceptional in order to be respected is unfair, I think. Yeah.
When the Southern blacks came here, there was a community of what we call the Victorian blacks who lived on Madison. There was a whole lot of them. And they looked down on the Southern blacks, you know, as sort of poor people. So when Washington bought a house, he bought it in the middle of the transitional area from the Madison Valley area and the Central District. It was very interesting where it, and that house, by the way, is an historic house you can visit. But it was really
Okay. Done.
Well, thank you for, oh, wait, we have another. One over here.
I was in Connecticut at the time of the internment. I learned all this from my wife, who's a Seattleite. But she told me that the reason the museum on Bainbridge Island is where it is that was the embarkation point for the Japanese coming off the island. And it was intentionally there where nobody ever went, instead of taking these people from a regular ferry. So that was the atmosphere of the time. It was secretive and keep it down. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you all for sharing your
you.
memories. And thank you, Lorraine, for another wonderful example of what history can do for us. Thank you for modeling that for us. And, you know, I think you heard that she modified this just for us today. So she went to that. Thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you. I think I'm